The day they smiled at my tears, something inside me broke in a way I never imagined possible. I remember every detail, the harsh fluorescent light flickering in the hallway, the cold tiles under my feet, and their faces twisted in amusement as if my pain was a spectacle made for them. I wasn't just hurt. I was erased, dismissed, treated as though I were invisible, a shadow with no right to exist. But even in that moment of crushing despair, something stirred within me, a spark so quiet that they didn't notice, a fire that had been lying dormant for years, waiting for the right moment to awaken. I didn't realize then that life was preparing me for a war I had never asked for, a battle where survival would require me to become someone I didn't even know existed yet. That evening, I walked slowly through the corridor, listening to their voices carry with ease and cruelty, each word a calculated knife meant to cut deeper than the last. "She won't survive without us. She cries too easily. Weak people always beg." They whispered, yet they were sure I would hear. Each phrase landed like a blow, but instead of collapsing, I stood still. Numb, not defeated, silently observing the predators who thought they had trapped me forever. I hadn't always been like this. Once I had believed in love, trust, loyalty, but life teaches the hard lessons fast and brutally. That night I sat at the edge of my bed, staring into my reflection in the darkened screen of my phone. My eyes were swollen, but behind them glimmered something unfamiliar, a quiet, resolute fire. A voice inside me whispered, "This ends with me." I wiped my tears, not because the pain had vanished, but because I refused to let it control me. I pressed my palms against the window, feeling the cold seep into my skin, a reminder that I had begun to become someone colder, stronger. Morning came quietly, and everything around me appeared unchanged, yet I was not the same person who had walked these rooms the day before. They didn't notice, of course. Cruel people rarely recognize the shift in those they aim to destroy. They continued their routines, dropping sarcastic remarks, feigning ignorance, thinking my silence was weakness, my calm acceptance of humiliation a surrender. But in reality, I had begun to rebuild myself quietly, carefully, invisibly. Every insult became fuel. Every betrayal became a blueprint for my strategy. Each memory of pain was catalogued, analyzed, stored. I learned their patterns, their vulnerabilities, the subtle ways they tried to manipulate everyone around them. And then came the night that changed everything, the night that cemented the final line between who I had been and who I was becoming. The rain fell hard against the windows, hammering with a relentless intensity as though the world itself were mourning for me. I wandered through the darkened house barefoot, my steps silent, but my heart racing with an intensity that made my own pulse sound like drums in my ears. I paused outside each room, recalling every moment I had cried alone behind these doors, every time I had begged for someone to see me, to hear me, to care. No one had ever come, but I didn't need them anymore. I had learned to stand alone. I returned to my room, sat on the cold floor, and let the stillness sink into me. My pain did not tremble, my anger did not burn. It focused, sharpened, ready. I opened a notebook and began writing, pouring every lie, every manipulation, every betrayal into words, crafting them into a record of truth. I wrote until my hand ached, and still I did not stop. Each word felt like a stitch, mending the broken parts of myself stronger than before. When morning returned, I did not hide my eyes, I did not shrink. They noticed immediately. One of them asked, "Feeling better?" I almost laughed. Better wasn't the word. Evolved was closer. I said simply, "I see everything now." That one sentence made them flinch, a tiny crack in their mask of control. That flinch told me everything I needed to know. They were finally afraid of the version of me they had never expected. And that fear was only the beginning of my justice. That night, I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling, tracing the memories of every wound they had inflicted, every subtle cruelty, every laugh at my expense. I realized I was no longer capable of being broken in the ways they had broken me. The version of myself that had cried, that had begged, that had silently endured humiliation, she no longer existed. In her place was someone sharper, colder, patient, methodical. I began to imagine the consequences they would never see coming, but not in a reckless way, careful, calculated, inevitable. I pictured the moments when their arrogance would be undone by their own underestimation of me. I saw their comfort crumble, their pride fracture, their smiles falter as they realized the quiet girl they dismissed had become the storm they could not outrun. Each thought, each plan was precise. I wasn't seeking vengeance merely for the sake of anger. I sought to expose the truth they had hidden behind their masks, to show them that every betrayal carries a cost, and that the cost was mine to assign. I had learned the cruelest lesson of all, that those who break others often believe that their cruelty is the final word. But cruelty never anticipates growth. I would be that growth. Silent, unstoppable, unseen until the moment I chose to reveal it. And then, as the rain tapped relentlessly against the windowpane, I felt the first rush of clarity that came with purpose. Not anger, not desperation, not fear, purpose. A mission born not out of hate alone, but out of a deep, unshakable resolve to ensure that every action I had endured would be returned to its sender in full measure. That night, I began not only to plan but to transform, to become the person who could not be predicted, controlled, or diminished. The old version of me, the broken, quiet, trembling girl, had vanished into memory. In her place stood someone else entirely, someone ready, someone precise, someone lethal in her patience. And they had no idea. They believed they had already won, that I would remain their shadow, silent and small. They were wrong, dead wrong. And when the time came, they would learn the truth in the most unavoidable, irreversible way possible. Because this wasn't just about surviving anymore. This wasn't just about enduring the pain they had caused. This was about taking every thread of betrayal, every stitch of cruelty, every whispered insult, and weaving it into a storm that would make them wish they had never crossed me. I would rise from every wound, stronger than before, and they would be powerless to stop me. This was the beginning, the first night of a journey they would not live to forget, the moment when the girl they tried to destroy silently became the force that would undo them. And I smiled quietly to myself, alone in the darkness, because I knew, finally, undeniably, that nothing would ever be the same again. Every step forward from this night, every thought, every plan, every breath I took was calculated, inevitable, and unstoppable. They had created the conditions for my destruction, and instead, they had forged the conditions for their own downfall. The spark inside me had become a flame, and soon, very soon, that flame would consume everything they had ever taken from me, and perhaps more. I closed my eyes and let the rain's rhythm sync with my heartbeat. The girl they underestimated, the one they thought had nothing left, was no longer underestimatable. She was everything they hadn't seen coming. She was the reckoning they would never escape. And deep inside, a cold, quiet smile formed as I whispered into the darkness. This ends with me, and it ends on my terms. The morning after that night, I woke with a strange clarity I had never felt before. The world around me was unchanged, yet everything inside me had shifted. I moved through the house quietly, observing them as they carried on with their routine, unaware that the person they had underestimated had begun to rise from the shadows of her own despair. I watched their gestures, the subtle twitch in their smiles, the way they glanced nervously at each other when they thought no one was watching. For the first time, I saw their fear, not the kind that trembles visibly, but the silent kind that bubbles beneath the surface, the kind that grows when control slips from your hands without you realizing it. I had crossed a threshold. I was no longer the one they could manipulate at will. My silence was no longer weakness. It was a shield, and it was stronger than any defense they had ever imagined. Each day I studied them, meticulously cataloging every lie, every act of manipulation, every instance where they had undermined me or underestimated my resolve. Every cruel comment I had endured became fuel. Every act of betrayal was stored in the depths of my mind like a carefully labeled weapon. And with every memory, I grew stronger, colder, sharper. I began to understand the art of waiting, the power of patience, the thrill of quiet anticipation. Revenge was no longer just a desire. It was a calculated inevitability. That evening, I walked to the window and gazed at the fading light, feeling the chill of the glass seep into my skin. I pressed my hands against it and let my thoughts wander over every detail of my suffering, every humiliating moment, every whispered insult. I could feel the weight of their arrogance, their confidence in my weakness, pressing down like a physical force. And yet, in that pressure, I felt clarity. I realized that nothing they had done could break me anymore. They had already tried, and their attempts had forged me into someone far stronger than they could comprehend. I began to plan, not out of blind anger, but with the precision of someone who understood that every move had consequences. I imagined each of their reactions, each of their failures, each moment where they would realize too late that they had miscalculated the wrong person. I would not strike recklessly. I would not act without reason. Each step would be deliberate, each action measured, each moment executed with perfect timing. And yet, while my mind was strategic, my heart remained fiery, a constant reminder of the pain they had caused me and the justice I was owed. That night, I walked through the house again, barefoot, silent like a shadow. I paused outside each room, replaying the memories of my suffering in my mind, turning them into lessons, into maps of the terrain I would navigate to reclaim my power. I felt no fear. I felt no hesitation, only purpose. Purpose wrapped around me like armor, shielding me from the pain I had endured, preparing me to unleash it in a way they would never see coming. I returned to my room, sat on the floor, and opened my notebook, filling pages with names, events, lies, and weaknesses. Each written word was a stitch, mending my broken spirit, building it stronger, sharper, colder. I wrote until my hand ached, and still I did not stop. Night deepened, and the silence of the house felt like my ally. I had become invisible but not powerless. Every whispered word they had spoken to belittle me, every sneer that had once wounded me, every glance of dismissal, they were all accounted for, transformed into knowledge, into strategy, into the foundation of my rising. When morning came again, I moved with quiet confidence. They noticed immediately. The subtle fear in their eyes told me they had begun to sense the shift they had ignored for so long. "You seem different," one of them said hesitantly. I smiled faintly, replying, "I see everything now." That simple sentence, steady and calm, carried a weight they could not comprehend. I watched as the realization settled in. They had underestimated me, and that was their first mistake. I was no longer the person who begged for attention, craved validation, or tolerated cruelty. I was now someone who existed entirely on her own terms, who would not be silenced, who would not be controlled, who would take every ounce of betrayal they had given me and return it multiplied. Their smiles faltered, their gestures became uncertain, and I understood fully that fear, subtle and creeping, had begun to take root. That fear was mine to cultivate, to nurture, to wield. I would make them feel the consequences of every single act they had committed against me. And as I stood alone in the quiet house, feeling the first stirrings of power flow through me, I whispered into the darkness, "This is only the beginning. I am coming, and there is nothing you can do to stop what I have become." That night, I slept not as the broken girl they had mocked, but as someone reborn, a strategist, a force, a storm waiting patiently to be unleashed. The girl who had cried silently, who had endured humiliation in the shadows, had disappeared completely. In her place stood someone unrecognizable, someone they would soon fear, someone they would learn to regret ever underestimating. Every step, every thought, every plan was precise, deliberate, inevitable. And when the moment arrived to show them the consequences of their actions, I would be ready. Not reckless, not impulsive, but unrelenting. And in that moment, I would see the truth reflected in their eyes. The girl they tried to break had risen far beyond their expectations, and their downfall would be my justice. The fire inside me burned steadily now, no longer a spark, but a roaring flame that promised inevitability, power, and control. And as I lay back, listening to the wind whisper through the empty streets outside, I understood fully that nothing would ever be the same again. They had shaped me through pain, and I had transformed that pain into strength beyond their comprehension. I smiled faintly in the darkness, because I knew the reckoning was coming, and when it did, it would be absolute, unstoppable, and unforgettable. The days that followed were unlike anything I had ever experienced. The house that once felt suffocating and oppressive had transformed in my perception. Each room, each corridor, each shadowed corner was now a stage upon which I quietly rehearsed my ascent. I moved silently through it all, noticing the subtle tremors in their expressions, the hesitation in their words, the flickers of doubt they tried desperately to hide. They still thought they were in control. They still assumed I was the fragile, silent girl they had always seen. But I was. The broken girl they had laughed at had died quietly that night, leaving behind someone sharp, patient, and deliberate. Every word they had spoken to belittle me had been catalogued, every cruel glance etched into my memory, and every betrayal carefully studied. I had begun to map their patterns like a master strategist anticipating a battle years in the making. I watched them from afar, noting the rhythms of their arrogance that once seemed endless, now revealing subtle cracks. and with each observation I felt the thrill of inevitability. I was no longer reacting to their cruelty. I was anticipating it, learning from it, becoming immune to it. That night I wandered through the house again, barefoot, silent, a shadow among shadows. I paused outside each door, letting the memories of past humiliations wash over me, not as pain, but as fuel. I remembered every time I had hoped someone would intervene, every time I had wished for protection, every moment of silent despair, and I realized I didn't need anyone anymore. I was enough. My anger had transformed into a sharp, calculated calm, and my sorrow had cooled into clarity. I opened my notebook and began to write, documenting every lie, every manipulation, every weakness I had observed, turning them into a weapon not of impulse, but of strategy. Each word stitched together a plan, weaving a tapestry of inevitability that I would execute without hesitation. Days turned into nights, and nights into quiet hours of meticulous preparation. I exercised patience, understanding that the strongest victories are never rushed, and that the smallest misstep could expose weakness. I sharpened my mind in silence, hunting my understanding of their vulnerabilities, imagining the precise moment when their overconfidence would betray them. They were oblivious, completely unaware of the force growing silently before their eyes. I observed how they moved, how they spoke, the subtle way they assumed I was still fragile, still weak, still theirs to dismiss. And with each false assumption, I grew stronger, more deliberate, more unshakable. My silence was no longer a shield. It was a weapon, invisible but lethal. I began to plan the exact moments when each truth I had discovered would collide with their arrogance, each consequence of their cruelty arriving at the perfect time, unanticipated, unstoppable, undeniable. My imagination became a rehearsal, each scenario unfolding in my mind with terrifying precision. I felt a strange exhilaration, not from hatred, but from the knowledge that I had finally reclaimed control over the chaos they had inflicted upon my life. One night, while the house slept and the world outside was drenched in silence, I walked to the window and stared at the city lights flickering in the distance. Their beauty was a reminder that life continues, indifferent to pain, indifferent to cruelty, indifferent to suffering. And yet I had learned that even in indifference there is power, the power to shape your own fate, to rewrite the narrative, to transform weakness into strength. I whispered softly to myself, "They have no idea what is coming." The words carried weight in the stillness, a vow and a prophecy intertwined. I felt the storm inside me gather strength, the calm before the inevitable reckoning. Each memory of betrayal, each insult, each moment of condescension became fuel for a methodical, relentless purpose. I trained myself to wait, to observe, to act only when the time was right, ensuring that every move would land with precision. I was no longer the person who endured pain. I had become its architect. Every plan I wrote, every detail I remembered, every weakness I catalogued was a thread in the web I would soon release. And in that quiet preparation, I found peace, a cold, calculating peace that came from understanding that justice does not demand haste, only inevitability. I slept lightly that night, alert to every sound, every movement, aware that the world was full of illusions, and that only awareness could turn the tide. I imagined the moment when their own arrogance would betray them, when their laughter would falter, when their confidence would crumble. I imagined their disbelief, their helplessness, the shock of seeing that the girl they had underestimated had become something they could not control, something they could not contain. And I smiled quietly in the darkness, feeling the power of inevitability settle around me like armor. I was no longer fragile. I was no longer silent. I was no longer theirs. And I knew, with every fiber of my being, that the reckoning would be perfect. The girl they tried to break had risen, unrecognizable, unstoppable, and ready. Nothing could undo what had been forged in fire, and nothing would prevent what had been meticulously planned. Each day, each observation, each silent calculation brought me closer to the moment where every act of cruelty they had committed would return to them multiplied, amplified, undeniable. They had created the conditions for my destruction, but unknowingly they had also created the conditions for their own undoing, and I would be the instrument. That night, as the wind whispered through the empty streets and the rain tapped against the windows, I felt the full weight of my transformation. I was no longer afraid. I was no longer trembling. I was the storm, the quiet shadow, the inevitable consequence of every injustice they had inflicted upon me, and I waited, patiently, silently, relentlessly. Because the moment of reckoning was coming, and when it arrived, it would be absolute, precise, and unforgettable. The following days were a study in patience and observation. The house that had once felt like a cage now became a training ground, a labyrinth where I learned to move unseen, to watch unnoticed, to anticipate every small gesture and every subtle shift in their expressions. They still believed they held all the power, still thought the girl they had broken would never rise. How wrong they were. Each step I took, each room I passed through was measured precise. I catalogued every lie, every manipulation, every cruel word they had ever spoken, and every instance where they thought they had control over me. Their arrogance had blinded them to the fact that I had become vigilant, aware, methodical. I began noticing patterns, how they laughed to mask insecurity, how they shifted their weight when they feared confrontation, how a single glance between them could reveal the truth they tried so desperately to hide. I memorized every nuance, storing it deep inside, knowing that each piece would serve me when the time came. That night, I wandered through the empty house barefoot, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside, feeling the cold floor beneath my feet. The memories of my suffering flooded back, but instead of pain, they brought focus. Every insult, every betrayal, every moment of humiliation was fuel. I had transformed sorrow into strategy, tears into understanding, weakness into invisible strength. Sitting at my desk, I opened my notebook and began writing again, not just the events of my past, but the detailed architecture of the plans I would implement, the careful timing of each step, the domino effect I intended to set in motion. Each word stitched together a vision of inevitability. I was no longer reactive. I was proactive, a force of consequence. Their misjudgment had become my advantage. They assumed I would remain the same girl who trembled in silence, who endured their cruelty without resistance. But I had learned the art of patience, the power of timing, and the satisfaction of calculated inevitability. I had transformed into someone unrecognizable, someone they could not predict, someone whose quiet exterior masked the storm that brewed beneath. Each night, I rehearsed the scenarios in my mind, running every possibility, anticipating their responses, calculating every ripple of consequence. I practiced restraint, knowing that the most devastating force is the one that strikes at the perfect moment, precise and unyielding. The fire that had sparked in me on that first night of realization had grown into a disciplined flame, a cold, methodical drive that demanded focus, strategy, and control. I had become an architect of inevitability, designing a web of consequences that would ensnare them in ways they never imagined. Their every action, every word, every tiny gesture of overconfidence had been noted and stored, each one a potential lever I could pull when the moment was right. The quiet of the house became my ally, allowing me to observe, to learn, to prepare without interference, without detection. And as the days passed, I felt the steady rise of power within me, the unmistakable awareness that I had crossed into a realm where I could not be broken. One evening, I paused by the window, staring at the darkened streets below. The rain tapped against the glass in a rhythmic cadence, a reminder that life continues regardless of the cruelty within it. And yet I had found a way to bend that life to my own terms. I whispered into the quiet room, "They will see what I have become, and they will wish they had never crossed me." The words carried weight, not as a threat, but as a declaration of inevitability. I had become someone who acted not from impulse, but from calculated understanding. I had become the one who could turn every act of betrayal into a weapon, every insult into leverage, every moment of underestimation into an opportunity. That night, I walked through the house again, tracing the familiar corridors, feeling the strength in my own steps, the quiet confidence in my own heartbeat. Each shadow seemed to echo my readiness, each silence reinforced my patience. I did not rush. I did not falter. I was preparing, always preparing. And I understood in that moment that the power I had gained was not just about revenge. It was about reclaiming myself, redefining who I was, asserting that no one could ever diminish me again. I was no longer the girl who cried in silence. I was no longer the girl who hoped for rescue. I was the storm they had ignored, the inevitability they could not escape, the consequence of every wrong they had inflicted. And as the night deepened, I felt a calm satisfaction. I had transformed my pain into strategy, my fear into clarity, my despair into determination. I was ready, ready to act, ready to strike, ready to reveal the force they had never expected. The girl they thought they could destroy had risen, unrecognizable, unstoppable, and patient. And she would not falter. Every plan I had crafted, every observation I had made, every quiet calculation I had stored would converge into a moment of undeniable truth. When it came, they would see the culmination of every insult, every betrayal, every act of dismissal return to them in ways they could never undo. And I smiled quietly in the darkness, knowing that the reckoning was near, that patience had prepared me for the perfect timing, and that every step forward from this night would bring me closer to the moment where all the power they thought they held would slip through their fingers forever. I lay down, feeling the cold sheets against my skin, the wind whispering through the open window. I closed my eyes and imagined the precise unfolding of every eventuality, the exact timing of each consequence, the perfect unveiling of truth and justice. I was not afraid. I was not trembling. I was ready. The storm had arrived silently, and soon it would be impossible to ignore. Every breath, every heartbeat, every quiet step I took was a reminder of what I had become, a force they could not stop, and a reckoning they would never forget. And as the rain continued to tap against the glass, I whispered once more into the darkness, "This is mine, and I will not fail." The morning sun filtered through the curtains, painting the room in muted gold, yet the warmth it carried did nothing to soften the steel inside me. The house was alive with their careless movements, their laughter, their false sense of security, but I moved among it all like a shadow that had learned every secret, every weakness, every unspoken fear. They still believed I was fragile, still assumed that the girl who had once trembled and cried silently was gone forever, leaving behind someone easily controlled. How wrong they were. Every glance they threw my way, every word uttered in my presence, every sigh and smile they thought was inconsequential, I catalogued. Every detail of their arrogance became a tool for the strategy I was meticulously building. That day, I lingered near the window for a long time, letting the sunlight wash over my face, a reminder that life moves relentlessly forward, indifferent to suffering, indifferent to pain, yet filled with opportunities for those willing to seize them. I could see the path ahead, intricate and treacherous, and it thrilled me in ways fear never could. By evening, I began rehearsing scenarios in my mind, walking through each room silently, imagining the exact sequence of events that would ensure my dominance, my justice, my reclamation of what they had tried to steal from me. Each memory of betrayal became a lesson, each act of cruelty a blueprint. I had become the archivist of their mistakes, a silent force waiting for the moment when their complacency would betray them fully. That night, the rain fell in heavy sheets, thrumming against the roof like a heartbeat in sync with my own. I walked barefoot across the cold floor, pausing outside the doors where memories of past pain were strongest. I recalled every insult, every whispered mockery, every sigh that had once cut deeper than a knife. Yet instead of wounding me now, these memories steeled me. They were no longer shackles. They were instruments, each one tuned to exact resonance, ready to be released with precision and inevitability. Sitting at my desk, I opened my notebook and wrote for hours, mapping weaknesses, predicting responses, noting the tiniest gestures that revealed hidden truths. I wrote until my hand ached, until my vision blurred, and yet I did not stop. Every word was a reinforcement of my resolve, a step closer to the eventual, unavoidable reckoning. Days blended seamlessly into nights, each one a rehearsal, a preparation, a silent accumulation of power. I trained my mind to remain calm, my body to move silently, my thoughts to anticipate every move they could make. Patience became my ally, observation my weapon, preparation my fortress. They remained blissfully unaware, lost in their illusion of control, their arrogance blinding them to the transformation unfolding before their very eyes. I watched their patterns, the way they assumed obedience, the ease with which they dismissed me, the casual cruelty they wielded as armor. I learned each rhythm, each predictable reaction, each flaw in their meticulously constructed facades. And I waited. I waited with the unwavering patience of someone who knows that the perfect moment is worth any length of time, that inevitability, when crafted carefully, cannot be denied. One night, I wandered to the window once more, listening to the distant city, feeling the rain soak the earth in its relentless rhythm. I let my thoughts trace the chain of events I would soon set into motion, each consequence measured, each action deliberate. I was no longer reacting to pain. I was converting it, transmuting it into precision, strategy, inevitability. I whispered softly into the darkness. They will see me, and they will understand the power they never anticipated. I could feel the shift inside me, a calm, chilling certainty that every plan, every observation, every patient hour of study had prepared me for an outcome so exact, so inevitable, it could not fail. The storm within me was no longer quiet. It hummed steadily, a force restrained, deliberate, unyielding. I walked through the house silently, touching the walls, feeling the familiar spaces, acknowledging the places where I had suffered, where I had cried, where I had been dismissed. Each corner, each shadow, each echo of past pain was now part of the blueprint, part of the foundation of the force I had become. I was ready, not as the fragile girl they had underestimated, but as the storm they could not predict, the inevitability they could not escape. I understood that my transformation was complete. I no longer needed anyone to intervene, no longer relied on hope, no longer awaited validation. I was the architect of consequence, the strategist of inevitable justice. And in that stillness, I smiled quietly. Every insult, every betrayal, every act of dismissal was now a thread in a web they would soon feel tightening around them. Every day I moved, I observed, I prepared. Every night I dreamed, I planned, I rehearsed. And I knew, with a clarity that was intoxicating, that the reckoning they had never expected was approaching. Every step I had taken, every thought I had recorded, every moment of patience and focus had built toward this crescendo, this inevitable unveiling of truth and power. The girl they thought they had broken had risen in silence, and soon she would make herself known in ways that could not be ignored, could not be denied, and could not be undone. And as the wind whispered outside, as the rain tapped relentlessly against the glass, I whispered to myself, I am ready, and they will regret every moment they underestimated me. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the rhythm of the storm outside, feeling the pulse of my own power, the steady hum of inevitability that would guide every move I would soon make. I closed my eyes, knowing that the patience, the preparation, the strategy would culminate in a moment they could not escape. And I was calm. I was ready. I was unstoppable. And when the moment came, every ounce of pain, every betrayal, every insult would return to them, multiplied, precise, undeniable. I would no longer be the girl they had controlled. I would be the storm. And they would see, finally, the force they had never anticipated. The days passed with a strange rhythm, each one a measured rehearsal, each one a silent lesson in patience and observation. I moved through the house with careful precision, my eyes noticing every subtle shift, every micro-expression, every imperceptible twitch that betrayed their thoughts. They still assumed I was fragile, still believed that the girl who had once trembled in silence was gone forever, leaving behind someone easily dismissed. But they were wrong. Every word they spoke, every careless laugh, every sigh meant to belittle or intimidate was absorbed, catalogued, and transformed into strategy. I was no longer a passive participant in their games. I had become the observer, the planner, the force quietly gathering power in plain sight. Each night, I wandered the corridors barefoot, feeling the cold floor beneath my feet, letting memories of past pain sharpen my resolve. I remembered every humiliation, every whispered insult, every moment I had hoped someone would intervene and found none. And in that solitude, I discovered my strength. I could endure, I could plan, I could wait. I could rise. Sitting at my desk, I opened my notebook and began documenting in precise detail the weaknesses I had observed, the patterns I had noted, the vulnerabilities they displayed when they believed no one was watching. Every observation became a potential lever, every note a thread in the web I would weave with meticulous care. Time became my ally. I no longer rushed. I no longer acted on impulse. Patience, calculation, and quiet determination became my weapons, sharpened and ready. I practiced restraint, understanding that the most devastating force is the one that arrives at the perfect moment, inevitable and unstoppable. One night I stood at the window, watching the rain wash the streets, listening to the rhythm of the storm as it mirrored my own pulse. I thought of every betrayal, every act of cruelty, every dismissal I had endured, and I felt no anger, only focus, only clarity. Each memory was fuel, each recollection a tool, each moment a step closer to the reckoning that was steadily approaching. I whispered softly into the darkness. They will see, and they will understand what they have underestimated. And I felt the undeniable surge of power that comes with certainty, the thrill of inevitability that courses through the veins of someone who knows they cannot fail. Every night, I rehearsed, I refined, I planned. Each scenario played out in my mind with exacting precision, until the sequence of events that would bring about their undoing became as clear as sunlight. I trained my mind to anticipate, my body to move silently, my heart to remain steady. No action was taken lightly, no detail overlooked, no opportunity ignored. I had become the storm that they had never expected, the shadow they could not perceive, the inevitability they could not escape. And in that silence, I felt the depth of my transformation. I was no longer the girl they had broken. I was the force that would reclaim every ounce of power they had tried to take. I had turned every tear into knowledge, every insult into strategy, every humiliation into strength. And with each passing day, the web of inevitability grew stronger, tighter, more precise. I began to visualize the moments when their overconfidence would betray them, the instances when their arrogance would crumble, the exact way in which they would realize far too late that the girl they had underestimated had become something unstoppable. I could feel it in the rhythm of my own heartbeat, in the quiet certainty that every move I had calculated would converge perfectly when the time was right. One night, I walked the halls again, barefoot, feeling each cold surface, acknowledging every echo of past suffering, and letting it become the foundation of my rising. I understood fully that my power lay not in rage but in meticulous preparation, in quiet patience, in the relentless accumulation of knowledge and understanding. They could not see it, they could not anticipate it, and they would not recognize it until it was too late. And that, I realized, was the sweetest part, the moment of reckoning born from years of observation, endurance, and transformation. I whispered into the darkness once more, "Everything they have taken will return, precise and undeniable." The storm within me had grown from a flicker to a steady blaze, a force tempered by time, patience, and clarity. Every breath I took, every silent step I made, every plan I documented was a testament to my unyielding resolve. I was ready. Not as a girl who trembled, not as a girl who hoped, not as a girl who cried in silence, but as the architect of consequence, the strategist of inevitability, the storm they could never escape. And as I lay down that night, listening to the rain, feeling the wind through the open window, I understood fully that the moment of truth was approaching. Every plan, every observation, every patient hour of preparation would culminate in the revelation of power and justice they had never anticipated. I closed my eyes and let the calm of certainty wash over me. I was no longer afraid. I was no longer fragile. I was unstoppable. The girl they thought they could destroy had risen, and soon they would see that no one underestimates her and escapes unscathed. Every ounce of betrayal, every insult, every act of cruelty would return multiplied, precise, and undeniable. The reckoning was inevitable, and I was ready to deliver it. The days blurred into a rhythm of silent observation, careful planning, and quiet anticipation. The house, once a prison of fear and humiliation, had become my arena. Every corner held memories of pain, every hallway echoed with moments of dismissal and mockery, and every shadowed room carried the weight of their arrogance. But I was no longer the girl who had trembled within these walls, begging silently for recognition, for mercy, for care. That version of me had been replaced by someone patient, calculating, and unstoppable. I moved through the house with measured steps, noticing the smallest gestures. The way their eyes flickered when they thought no one was watching, the subtle tension in their posture when they believed they were in control, the unspoken signals of overconfidence that would one day betray them. Each observation was meticulously recorded in my mind, catalogued as a part of a strategy that had been slowly taking shape over weeks, months, and sleepless nights. Every cruel word they had spoken, every slight, every manipulation, had been transformed into knowledge, into leverage, into the blueprint for the reckoning I was preparing. The quiet of the house became my ally. I wandered its halls barefoot at night, letting the memories of betrayal sharpen my resolve rather than wound me. I retraced the places where I had once cried, where I had once been dismissed, and I felt the weight of power settle into my bones. I opened my notebook and wrote relentlessly, mapping weaknesses, predicting reactions, and imagining every possible scenario with exact precision. Nothing was left to chance. Every step had purpose, every plan had direction, every outcome had inevitability. I was no longer a victim of circumstance. I had become the architect of inevitability. One evening, as the rain tapped against the windows, I stood at the window, listening to the rhythm of the storm, and allowed myself to feel the calm thrill of inevitability. I whispered softly to the shadows, "They will see me, and they will understand that I was never to be underestimated." The words carried a weight that was not boastful but quietly absolute. Each night I rehearsed, refining my strategies, visualizing the exact way each act of justice would unfold, the precise moment when the arrogance they relied on would become their undoing. My mind was focused, my body steady, my heart calm yet unyielding. Every breath, every silent step, every subtle movement became part of the preparation for the moment I would no longer remain unseen, unrecognized, underestimated. Days turned into nights, and nights into endless hours of careful observation and mental rehearsal. I watched how they assumed control, how they believed that their dominance over me was absolute. Their arrogance was my ally. Their underestimation was my weapon. And as the hours passed, I felt the thrill of inevitability strengthen, the certainty that every action they had taken against me would one day return multiplied, precise, undeniable, and unstoppable. One night, I stood again in the darkness, feeling the chill of the floor beneath me, listening to the whispers of the storm outside, and felt the full power of my transformation. I was no longer the girl who had hoped, who had begged, who had trembled silently. I was the storm, patient, relentless, and precise. Every insult, every betrayal, every act of cruelty had been absorbed, analyzed, and turned into a weapon I could deploy at the perfect moment. I knew when it would come, and I knew that when it did, they would have no choice but to witness the truth they had denied for so long. I had learned the art of waiting, the power of anticipation, and the satisfaction of inevitability. My revenge would not be hasty or reckless. It would be deliberate, precise, and unavoidable. And as I walked the silent halls, I imagined the look on their faces when the reality of their miscalculation struck them. The shock, the fear, the helplessness, the realization that the girl they had tried to destroy had become far stronger than they ever imagined. I smiled quietly, knowing that their overconfidence, their arrogance, their casual cruelty had been meticulously logged, and now it would be used against them with perfect timing. I had become the embodiment of all they had ignored, all they had dismissed, all they had underestimated. And I was ready. Each night I strengthened my resolve, honed my strategies, refined my patience, and allowed my mind to become a precise instrument of inevitability. Nothing was left to chance. Everything was planned. Every move, every reaction, every possible consequence had been calculated. I was no longer afraid, no longer trembling, no longer fragile. I was unstoppable. The girl they believed they had broken had risen silently, unseen, unchallenged, and far more powerful than they could comprehend. And in that quiet, dark moment, as the storm raged outside, I whispered again, "I am ready. And when it comes, they will feel every ounce of what they have inflicted, multiplied and precise. They will regret underestimating me." The transformation was complete. I was no longer defined by their cruelty or their manipulation. I was defined by my own patience, my own strategy, my own relentless determination. And soon, very soon, they would see the force they had unknowingly created. I would not stop. I could not stop. The storm had arrived, and it would not be denied. The reckoning was inevitable, and I would be the one to deliver it, flawless, unstoppable, and unforgettable. Every step forward, every quiet breath, every patient hour brought me closer to the moment when every betrayal, every insult, every moment of underestimation would return to them, precise, undeniable, and irreversible. They had created the conditions for their own downfall, and I would be the instrument of justice they had never seen coming. And as I stood in the stillness, listening to the distant thunder, I smiled with the cold satisfaction of inevitability, knowing the storm I had become could not be stopped, could not be ignored, and would never be forgotten. The dawn broke quietly over the city, casting a pale light across the rooms where once I had been invisible, dismissed, underestimated. But I was no longer that girl. The months of silent observation, relentless planning, and patient preparation had transformed me into someone unrecognizable, someone precise, unstoppable, inevitable. Every insult, every betrayal, every cruel glance had been meticulously recorded, analyzed, and stored, not as wounds, but as tools for the reckoning that was finally ready to unfold. I moved through the house with silent steps, barefoot on the cold floors, feeling the weight of every memory, every moment of past pain, yet carrying within me a calm, unshakable certainty. They still believed they held power, still assumed the girl they had tried to destroy would never rise. How wrong they were. I had become a shadow in plain sight, an observer of every weakness, every subtle miscalculation, every instance of arrogance that would ultimately be their undoing. Each plan I had written in my notebook, every scenario I had visualized, every calculated move rehearsed mentally over endless nights, had led to this moment. And now, the time had come to set the inevitable into motion. I could feel the storm inside me, quiet yet insistent, a force that had grown patiently and steadily over months, now ready to strike with precision and certainty. I paused at the window, watching the rain-slicked streets below, feeling the rhythm of my own heartbeat sync with the rhythm of the storm outside. I whispered into the quiet, "They will see me, and they will know that nothing they have done can ever be hidden from the consequences they deserve." Each memory of betrayal and insult, each act of dismissal, had been transformed into a tool of meticulous strategy, a thread in the web of inevitability I had woven so carefully. They would not recognize it until it was too late. They would not comprehend the force they had created by underestimating me. And in that quiet, solitary preparation, I felt a sense of power unlike anything I had ever known, a power born not of recklessness, but of patience, clarity, and unwavering determination. I moved silently through the house, touching the surfaces, acknowledging the echoes of my past suffering, and transforming them into a blueprint for the storm I had become. I understood fully that my strength lay not in emotion, but in calculation, in precision, in the inevitability of every consequence I had prepared. Every glance they had given me, every word spoken with cruelty, every false assumption had become a weapon I could deploy at the perfect moment. I was no longer fragile. I was no longer the girl who hoped for mercy. I was the force that would reclaim every ounce of power they had tried to take. And as I prepared, every detail sharpened, every scenario rehearsed, I could feel the approaching inevitability. I smiled quietly, knowing that soon they would understand, too late, that the girl they had underestimated was the one they could not escape. I lay awake that night, listening to the rain tapping against the roof, imagining their faces when realization struck them. The shock, the helplessness, the acknowledgement that they had misjudged someone who had grown far stronger than they ever imagined. I was calm, collected, and unstoppable. The months of preparation, of patience, of silent endurance had culminated in this exact moment. And I knew that when the time came, everything would unfold with perfect precision, every betrayal returned, every insult multiplied, every act of cruelty exposed and accounted for. They had created the conditions for their own undoing, and I had become the instrument of inevitability. And yet, even in the quiet intensity of anticipation, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction, a quiet smile forming as I acknowledged the power I now held, the power to act, to reveal, to reclaim, and to dominate the consequences they had so carelessly ignored. My heart no longer trembled, my spirit no longer quivered, my resolve no longer wavered. I had become unbreakable, untouchable, and unstoppable. And as the first light of dawn touched the room, I understood fully that the storm I had become could not be denied, could not be contained, and would not be forgotten. Everything I had endured, everything I had transformed into strategy, every silent tear, every sleepless night, had led to this precise moment. I was the shadow they had ignored, the force they had dismissed, the reckoning they could not escape. And I waited, patient, deliberate, relentless. For when the moment came, they would know the truth. The girl they had tried to destroy had risen, unrecognizable, unstoppable, inevitable, and nothing could ever change that. I took a deep breath, letting the calm certainty fill me completely, and whispered one final truth into the quiet house, a promise to myself and a warning to them. This ends on my terms, and there is no escape from what I am about to unleash. The storm had arrived, silent, patient, perfect. And soon, every consequence they had ignored, every act of cruelty they had inflicted, every betrayal they had committed would come rushing back, precise, undeniable, and irreversible. The girl they underestimated had become the force of inevitability, and nothing would ever be the same again. Every detail, every plan, every carefully observed weakness would converge in a single, unstoppable moment of truth. And in that moment, they would finally see the power of the one they thought they could destroy. I smiled quietly, listening to the rain, feeling the calm and the storm intertwine, and knew with absolute certainty that the reckoning had begun. The girl they tried to break had risen, and she would not falter. And so I waited, patient, silent, and prepared, knowing that the moment of justice, of power, and of truth would arrive, and nothing could stop it. If you've ever been underestimated, rise silently and let them witness your storm.